So hi everyone and welcome to the Perisseuma Podcast with me, John. Perisseuma, if you don't know, is this Greek word. You might have guessed it was Greek. You might have heard what it means. It basically just means abundance. It means overflow. And it's a word that Jesus uses when he describes either the overflow of the heart, the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And we started this podcast really out of a hunger, a desire to do ministry and life out of an overflow of a conversation with God, an ever deepening conversation, relationship with God. And so it's just a chance to chat with people about how do you nurture that? How do you foster that? How do you protect that? And I'm still today to have Rob with us, the Reverend Robert John May, as I found out from the Meet the Team video. Rob is the latest addition to the regional team here, the Baptist regional team here in South Wales. Rob, it's great to have you with us.
Good to be with you, really good to be with you. Great to be in Wales too.
Yes, I was going to say, if nobody's asked me to do this, but on behalf of the people of South Wales, welcome to Wales. I can just see over your shoulder, you've started unpacking. You've got a kind of a Welsh scarf. Is that in the background?
I have indeed, yes. That was my youngest daughter's living in Cardiff, studying at the Baptist College, and that was her first gift to me once we got appointed. So she said, "You've got to have a Welsh scarf, Dad." So that's sitting back there at the moment. So well spotted.
It is essential. It's absolutely essential.
With one or two other cardboard boxes that have yet to be unpacked.
But that's not your only connection to Wales.
No, not at all. It's been it's been quite an interesting journey because I became a Christian in Wales. So what I've been saying in one or two places is, although I was born in England, I was born again in Wales at University in Bangor in North Wales. And that's where Lindsay and I met for the very first time. I'd not been a Christian very long, and I think it could well have been my first ever Christian Union meeting, and managed to get myself introduced. And very soon after that, we were together. And as they say, the rest is history. So so it's been lovely coming back. So those two journeys began in Wales. So it's nice that they're back now, continuing here.
And tell us a little bit, Rob, about your sense of call to regional ministry.
Yeah, it's been, as you can imagine with these things, it has been a bit of a journey. I mean, I've been a local pastor for 24 years, or just finished being a local pastor for 24 years, and I've absolutely loved that. I mean, it's had its moments, of course, it's had its hard times and its challenges, but on the whole, it's been a very blessed time serving in the three churches that I was able to be blessed to be part of. But all the way through that, there's always been two other strands which have always been part of my sense of ministry. So one was a wider teaching strand. So I've been at various times and sort of involved at Spurgeon's College as an associate tutor and online tutor. And so that whole aspect of training and developing other leaders, teaching other leaders, as well as my own sort of stimulation and growth, has been a big part of that. But also, I've always had quite a natural instinctive commitment to association life. Beyond that, I've not really been very interested. So it's been interesting now, sort of in a slightly wider setting. So beyond association life, I've generally left that with others, but been very committed to association life. So both first in the southeast of England when I was there, and then more recently in London. So I've always had that kind of wider sort of interest, and I think at different times I've suppressed it more or less, but there's always been a sense that one day at some point perhaps I would move on from local church into a different setting. Never quite sure whether that might be in a more academic teaching setting or in supporting association life. And as that's unfolded, it became clearer and clearer that actually working as a regional minister on supporting an association really was what God was leading us to and directing us to. And then after that, it really was a case of, well sort of where might that be? And I applied for one job, and that didn't sit well, and so we moved on from that. And then this South Wales job came up, and yeah, and here we are today. So yeah, that went very well.
Yeah, and living in Newport.
Living in Newport, yeah, so just on the northern fringe of Newport, very, very close to the motorway. So it's just that way. I can open the windows, you can hear the gentle rumble of traffic. So it's ideal for getting on the road, because one of the things I've to learn overnight is that there's a lot of travelling involved with this role. Having been in London for the last 8 years and barely used the car at all, because public transport's so amazing in London. So now I'm out on the road a lot more. So we wanted somewhere that was you could get on the road quite quickly. So yeah, so enjoying being in Newport, but also what we are also enjoying is that almost every which way you look, you can see the hills in the distance, and I'm actually finding that very good, very sort of good for my soul. Just very sort of restful and pastoral and those sorts of things. So yeah, so we're here in Newport.
Yeah, amazing. And for people who maybe are listening or watching, who just don't know what is a regional ministry, what does that mean? I guess what's your vision? Like if we were to fast forward 5 years, 10 years, and say, what's success sort of look like? What's your sort of vision for regional ministry?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the obvious things are. The kind of strap line is that we provide pastoral and strategic support to church leaders and church leadership teams and churches across the breadth of the association. And that's absolutely right. And that's exactly what we do. And then underneath that, there are various particular roles that have to be fulfilled, whether it's sort of working with people who feel called to ministry, and the Ministerial Recognition Committee, which you'll be aware of, others might not be, and other just the nitty-gritty of all of that. But I think for me, at the heart of what I've always appreciated about the regional ministers that I've been blessed by is their proactive concern for me as a local minister, that actually they're there to, in a sense, to serve the servants, to pastor the pastors. To everyone always asks me in pastoral ministry, who pastors you, Rob? Who pastors the pastors? And in a sense, we as Baptists we've set apart regional ministry teams to do that. Now that comes with enormous challenges. It's a big patch. There's a lot of churches to pastor. There's a lot of pastors to pastor. We can never meet everybody's needs, and we always have to live with that in pastoral ministry. Just because you're raw material as people, never fulfill all of that to everybody's satisfaction. But nevertheless, you try, and you try your best. So I think it's at that individual level the ministers feel supported. Churches feel they've got somewhere to go and turn to that is receptive, and that they're not bothering us. That's what we're here for. We're here to support you. But then beyond that, to get a sense of, if you like, I don't know, to help shape the culture, just to shape an underlying culture within our association. And years ago, I went to America to see one of these fancy churches in Los Angeles, and the leader handed me his business card, and it described himself as the cultural architect. He wasn't the senior pastor, he wasn't whatever, he was the cultural architect. And I just sort of rolled my eyes and thought, oh my goodness me, that's all a bit cheesy and whatever, very American or something. And but actually, the more I reflected on it, the more I thought, actually, this, I wouldn't have it on my business card, but in some ways it's absolutely right. As leaders, we set the tone for the culture of whatever organization we're leading. And I think as a team, I hope to have some impact on that, to be able to shape just how we feel. What is the culture of the association? What will it, if somebody from outside comes and joins, takes on a pastoral role within the association, what will they come into? How will it feel when we're together in ministers clusters and things like that? What will be our reputation? How will people speak of us? That kind of thing. So I'd hope that that also goes alongside all of that as well.
Mm.
But yeah, it's been an interesting role. I'm still trying to get my head around it all. So Mark and the team have been very generous. They've not bombarded me with lots of information at the start. I'll learn as I go along and pick things up, and you can feel it starting to pick up pace. Certainly my email traffic has significantly increased in the last few weeks. So yeah. So I think that's kind of where I would be with it all. Yeah, there's somebody out there, there's an arm around to encourage, to bring hope and joy, and to lift for when heads are dropping a little bit, to say, yeah, no, come alongside. And hopefully to do that out of my own experience as well. So yeah.
No, that's great. I love the idea of the cultural architect. That's not something I'd come across, but sort of setting a tone, establishing a culture. That's really helpful. On the Meet the Team video that you were good enough to subject yourself to for us, I think, which I think you did a while back, wasn't it? It was before you moved.
Yeah, it's a little while ago now. Yeah.
You were asked to describe yourself in, I think it was 4 words. You went for 5. You said you were sort of calm, thoughtful, friendly, and then the last one you said sort of interested or curious. So I was interested just to dig under that a little bit. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mentioned this to my wife, and she said, "Yeah, you're just nosy," and that is true. And I think as I've got older, I've got nosier. And
is that on your business card?
It's just it could easily be. If it's on the front, it will certainly be on the reverse. I mean, I guess I've just been naturally curious. I mean, it's just part of my personality, and I'm a bit of a magpie in terms of if I see anything shiny, I'm after it, and that sort of thing. If you invite me around for a meal, I'm likely to be scanning your books or your DVD collection, just trying to.
Good to know.
I'm interested, and what does that mean, and things like that. And I like to ask the questions rather than answering them, I suppose. But I think a long time ago, I just accepted the fact I just find people really interesting, and everybody has an interesting story. I think the first ever funeral I took, and we all kind of remember our first ever funeral. It was just, you're anxious, you're nervous, you want to get it right, etc., etc. But if I remember the story correctly, it was an old woman who died, and the story within the family was, it was one of those moments where I've got to speak on behalf of the family, do the eulogy, and they were struggling to say very much about her, except that the family story was that she was the very first person to hear that the Nazis had surrendered at the end of the Second World War, and she lived on a little sort of council estate. This is in Hawley, where my first church was, because she'd happened to work in Churchill's office or something. She had some kind of minor role, and but had got to know Churchill quite well. And just after Churchill had taken the call from the German High Command that they'd surrendered, she just happened to be stood by the door, and he just whispered in her ear, and I won't give you the full quote, but you can probably imagine, just they've surrendered, they've surrendered.
Wow.
And then he went out to tell the nation, and it was just that you never know the stories that people are carrying, unless you ask and unless you take time to listen. So I've just found people really, really interesting. I remember Ricky Gervais said something along the lines of talking about drama. He said if you sit sort of in a coffee shop or something like that and just watch for 10-15 minutes, you've got all the drama you could imagine just going on in the ordinariness of life in front of you. But there's things going on all the time, and if you can read what's happening. So I think that's a big part of it, and I enjoy gathering information. I read a fair bit. I read quite widely, those sorts of things. But yeah, I'm just very nosy.
That's great.
Yeah.
I love that. I remember years ago watching a TED talk I think it's one of the most popular ones, or certainly was back then, How to Have a Great Conversation. And it's by this radio host from America. And her dad was somebody relatively famous. I think he was in politics. And they would regularly have these sort of dinner parties where they'd have, dignitaries from all over the world. And she said, as people were coming or leaving, he would always say, "Oh, this is so and so. They are blah, 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 blah." And she said it sort of left her with this sort of idea that everybody had this sort of a secret thing about them. And one of her things about having great conversations is just assume that there will be something of interest or value or whatever it is, and you won't be disappointed. And it's just true, isn't it? People are fascinating.
Yeah. And I do take that thing. I mean, we joke about it, but God created us with 2 ears and 1 mouth. And in a world that's not very good at listening well, I think as Christians, I think we have a responsibility to be good listeners. I remember as part of my training in terms of pastoral ministry, one of the greatest dignities we can do to our church members is to listen well. It's to give them the dignity of a good listen. And not one of those distracted listens where our eyes are twitching, looking for the more interesting person that we think, because actually this human being before us, created in the image of God, is of infinite dignity and worth, and we can communicate that to people. I think that's for me underlies some of this as well.
And it's sort of fundamentally Christ-like, isn't it? And the times when somebody was judging somebody or whatever it was, and Jesus would ask them, do you see this woman? And that's the trouble, is we don't, do we? We see a type of person, or we see a label or whatever it is. And of course, Jesus had that sort of divine insight into us, didn't he? But there is something, the amount of questions that Jesus asks, he didn't have to. I mean, he could have just known. But it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. So that's kind of where that came from. I'm just and more in London, I kind of discovered history and exploring, sort of doing these self-guided walks and things like that, and then that opens up a whole area of interest, and you start to explore your locality then, and you understand a little bit more, not just the history of, but in a sense, locating God, I guess, in our localities, and see where the work of God is, and where the and the impact our localities have on our local churches. I've become a great believer that geography is a huge factor in how we understand how our witness is to wherever our locality is, and we need to understand that and be curious about that, and be curious about where is God active beyond the boundaries of our church. So we ought to be, as Christians, quite interested in the world out there. This is God's world, and God is active out there. And the kind of, oh my goodness, where on earth is God now? What on earth is he up to now?
I love the thought that somehow the geography shapes that as well. That's not something I've really thought about before.
Yes, I mean, in my previous church, last church we just left in Herne Hill, the railway line cut right through the middle of Herne Hill,
right,
and there was a narrow sort of tunnel going through. I mean, bridge. You went under the railway line, but to get across the railway line further up or down the line, you had to go quite a long way to get, and so it created sort of 2 Herne Hills, if you like. There was a Herne Hill, and if anybody knows South London, that is more kind of has a more of a Brixton or Tulse Hill feel of it, so very multicultural, very diverse. And on the other side of it, it was much more connected with Dulwich and a sort of a more white upper middle class affluent thing, and it was just the fact that a railway line ran through it, and therefore how did we as a church sort of relate to that? And a similar thing actually in my first church in Hawley, there's a train line ran straight down the centre through Hawley, and in fact the A23, which is if you've ever heard the London to Brighton, anything that London to Brighton goes straight down the A23, which cuts again straight through Hawley. So it kind of divided the community in half, and so how do we relate to different parts of it and the impact that had? So yeah.
mm.
Yeah. And sometimes
Yeah.
it explains actually why some people find accessing church easier or harder, or relate more easily or less easily. Sometimes it's just an accident of geography and where they happen to live, and
Yeah.
things like that. And what as churches can we do to be aware of that and do something
Mm,
about
mm. Wow. So in terms of ministry then, and the sort of the life of ministry, um, what kind of things do you think have helped you in terms of your own relationship with God? It's very easy in ministry, isn't it, to sort of enter into that slipstream of, the next thing that needs to be done, and just going to God for, I need an idea about this, or I need a solution for that, or energy for this. And God can kind of become the sort of the partner that you work with. And I think we have to work hard, don't we? Or certainly I have to work hard to maintain that relationship with God as Father, as friend, as Savior. And so what kind of things help you with that?
Yeah, that's I mean, I think recognizing that I don't know about you and the colleagues you've spoken to, but most of the colleagues I've spoken to also struggle at times. There's very
Mm,
few where their relationship with God is always sunshine and
mm,
meadows and bright lights
mm,
and etc. etc. We all struggle to maintain that, and so therefore it's nothing unique to me.
mm,
And but also that it ought to be a struggle, because I remain a broken, sinful human being. I'm
mm,
yet to be fully redeemed, so it would be unusual for me not to have struggles. We live within the midst of a spiritual battle. The world, the flesh, and the devil
mm, mm,
are a reality, which we can overplay and make excuses, but equally we can underplay and be not as mindful of that as we
mm,
ought to be.
mm,
Um, and and I think the things that have helped me. So, so I didn't grow up going to church at all. I became a Christian at university with very, very little experience of church at all.
mm,
Um, and so I came to it very fresh, and my conversion was for me, was quite a powerful, very real experience. I could take
mm,
you to D3 Plasguin. That was the hall of residence I was in at Bangor University. That's where,
mm,
if
mm,
the building's still there, I could take you to the room.
mm,
Woke up the following day, bigger. And my early experience was evangelical, charismatic evangelical, Pentecostal evangelical. And so the classic evangelical quiet time was my formative
mm,
way of connecting with God. You get up early in the morning, because that's what you have, your quiet time in the morning.
mm,
The lazy people have it in the evening, but if you're more spiritual you are, then you have it in the morning. And
mm.
the earlier you have it in the morning, the more spiritual you are, and the longer you have it in earlier, and so on. You're
Yeah,
familiar
yeah,
with all
yeah,
of this. And so
yeah.
that was my sort of, that's how you relate to God. That's how you connect with God. You
Mm,
read the Bible and you pray your prayers, and that's how you begin your day. And that became my pattern. And getting up in the morning has never been a problem for me, and it still isn't
mm,
a
mm,
problem for me. Although as a consequence, I'm now going to bed earlier and earlier. So
mm.
going to an early night is a blessing and not a curse to
Yeah,
me.
yeah,
Um, and I get married, and I'm working as a school teacher, but I can still get up early and have my quiet time, and etc. And then our first child is born, and our first child doesn't realize they're supposed to accommodate my early morning patterns and give me a good night's sleep, and suddenly the whole thing is thrown up in the air.
mm,
And so I've got to wrestle with that and adapt to that. But all I've got is this early morning quiet time. Read your Bible and pray. That's the kind of
mm,
the mechanism, if you like. That's the model for
mm,
connecting with God. So I'm fighting to try and carve out time. Okay, I'll reduce it a little bit. Perhaps I will. And I think, therefore, over time, I've learned a number of things simply through that experience that actually going to college opened up for me, that there are all kinds of resources available for us to connect with God, drawing on the different traditions beyond the things as evangelicals that we are very good at, and we contribute to that, to the wider Christian tradition, but we can learn from other traditions. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So that became a big part of it. There are other ways of connecting with God that actually are just as enriching and just as good for you as the classic evangelical quiet time. I think I also learned to be kind to myself, to rejoice in I can't remember where the quote comes from, but be thankful for the prayers you can pray, rather than get frustrated about the prayers you can't pray, if that makes sense. So be kind to yourself. The context does have an impact, that times of life and seasons of life have an impact, and therefore you need a spirituality that can flex with that, and move with the different seasons and complexities of life, and therefore to move away from something that's quite rigid and daily, to seeing perhaps the way I relate to God in over a 7-day cycle, or over a month. And sometimes in the week I can have slightly more time, other times in the week perhaps that time is reduced, but there may be times in the week where morning's not so good, but perhaps in the day. So all of that sort of thinking I found really, really helpful and liberating. I found liturgy for me hugely beneficial, discovering liturgy. I remember somebody talking about the tyranny of extempore prayer. Just that I read my Bible and now I have to kind of grit my teeth and say my prayers. And again, nothing wrong with that, but the pressure for it to come from you over time can become quite exhausting, and ultimately repetitive. And to discover a daily office, so a daily rhythm of prayer, so morning prayers and prayers at lunchtime and noon, for me has been hugely beneficial. That in those moments where I'm struggling to pray, I have these prayers that hold me. And even in the rhythm and pattern of those, they give me, they prime the pump, if you like, that morning, and start my prayer life going. And then there's gaps where, of course, I can bring my own prayers, or silence. Actually, for me, I've embraced, actually, it's okay to just to sit in silence. I mean, as evangelicals, we can be very noisy. We have to fill with noise, and we have to fill with words. We're very sort of noisy driven, we're very word driven. Even if, I don't know if you've experienced this, but sometimes when I was leading, say in a communion service, we say while we're handing out the bread or something, we'll have a time of silence, and you can feel the discomfort in the room, or a musician who can't cope with that will suddenly start playing something gently underneath, because they just can't cope with the silence.
Accompany the silence,
accompany the silence. Those sorts of, be still and know that I am God, and so to embrace silence. I've just come to the end of a relationship with a spiritual director back in London. She was a former nun, and she would begin each day with it was either an hour or 2 hours of silent prayer, and then she would read her Bibles and say her prayers, etc., etc. And I couldn't begin to get my head around that. But the discipline of sitting in the presence of God and just learning to enjoy his presence without feeling the need. It's okay to come before you say anything, before you seek after anything, before you petition God for anything, ask for anything. You are loved. You can just rest in that presence. You can just curl up in that place. So I think that's been really helpful as well. And I think, in fact, in preparation for this, there's a book by a guy called George Lings. It's called 7 Sacred Spaces. So it's based on the 7 spaces of a monastic community. So as a monk, you would have your cell where you would go for private prayer. So there's your evangelical private quiet time, although the other traditions have the same. So you go away by yourself and spend time alone with God. But there's also then the chapel, which is where we gather for corporate worship. So Sunday service would be the equivalent of that. The chapter house is where the decision making goes on, where there's discussion and conversation, and you seek God together about the way forward for the community or for yourself. The cloister I love. So that's where you either go and meet people, plan to meet somebody, or unplanned, you wander around the cloisters. Who am I going to bump into today? And so where does that feature in your life? Where is your cloister? And I'll perhaps come back to that in a moment. There's a garden. So that's where you do something creative with other people, and you just enjoy God's creation and the creativity that God has given us. The refectory, where we have meals together and we eat together. And I think we would do well to recover a sacredness to the meal table, and see the power and the importance of who we welcome to our table. It's a big deal for Jesus, who he was eating with, and who he offended by the fact that he was eating with people, and what that communicated. And then the scriptorium, so the library, and being enriched by the library, and the reading of both in terms of technical stuff for the role, but also I've read a lot more fiction now, crime fiction, things like that. But all of that for me is enriching. And so what I've found for me that's been helpful is, rather than putting all of my eggs, my spiritual eggs, in the cell, my private personal prayers with God, important as that is, I've been able to spread, I don't know if it's a metaphor, spread some of the eggs around into these other places as well. So if I didn't have quiet time that morning, but I bump into somebody unexpectedly, as I think I'll just pop out for 10-15 minutes, bump into somebody, and then I have an encounter with God, and God speaks to me, or something happens, then that has validity to it. So the two things I did in my previous church, which I kind of last church, from learning from the two previous churches, was I decided every morning I would go to the same coffee shop, sit in the same chair at the same time, and just see what God, that was my cloister, see who God might bring along. And sometimes I planned to meet somebody there, and that became, and I say this understanding what this means, a sacred place. And I would say to Claire, who ran the coffee shop and became a good friend, and the people, so that became quite a sacred place and part of my daily rhythm. And sometimes I would say my prayers there, do my liturgy. Sometimes somebody would come in and I'd have an awkward conversation or an annoying conversation because they were disturbing me, but something would come out of that. And I got to know people regularly. So that was one thing that I think I found really helpful. And the other thing, which I'd missed from the previous two churches, was to join something and be part of something completely not connected with church life. In anything. I went for a local community choir, and that became my garden, if you like, that place where I did something creative together with, and we produced. And there's something incredibly powerful I discovered about singing and the power of the human voice to make music and to sing together. And it was a mixed choir, so we had 4 parts: alto, soprano, tenor, and bass. And actually, when we hooked it up, we sound pretty good, and I learned a lot through that. And I said to them when I left, so they let me say a few words on my final thing, and I said, this also has become part of my sacred. This is a sacred space for me. This is a place where I encounter God. I see God in you and in the music we make together. And so all of those things have kind of, back to the original question, helped me expand where I encounter God and have given validity to that. And so I'm less anxious about whether or not I had my quiet time this morning. I try not to be casual about that, because I know that there are plenty of other occasions where God and I will relate and be in fellowship with. But it also, who have I invited to my table? Who do I make an effort to perhaps meet, or do I actually take time to walk outside the building and see who God might bring into my life? Am I
mm,
reading? Is that part of my life? Who do I
mm,
sit down with to discern God's will for my life? That sort of chapter working out. So it
yeah,
helps me to ask those questions as much as it provides a kind of framework which for me gives a much broader understanding of
mm,
my world and where I might find
mm,
God and God in people.
mm. That's really really helpful, Rob, in terms of the seven sacred spaces, and it goes back, I guess, to we label some things as sacred, don't we? And then the rest as secular. And there's almost this sort of assumption that it's probably the sacred is probably the tiny
Yeah.
percentage of life, and but being open to meeting Christ in the
Mm.
other, and yeah, and like you were saying, just being deliberately intentional about going to the garden to find creative spaces that you connect with others, but also enter into God's creation as well. That's really beautiful. Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. No, it is, and I think you're absolutely right. We have this. We like to say we don't have this sacred secular divide, but we do,
Mm,
and we think there are places where we're more likely to meet God and places where we're less likely to meet God.
mm,
But it seems to me if there's of many lessons we can learn from the Gospels and Jesus's experience, is that the religious people who assume they had a monopoly on where you encounter God in the religious sort of
yeah.
environments, the institutions, the temple, tabernacle, not tabernacle, what do you call the place? Synagogue,
Mm, mm,
that kind of thing. Actually, Jesus was encountering God in places where they would say, well, you're not going to find the God there. I don't even know why you're bothering with those people and
yeah.
going into those places and sitting with that
Yeah.
Samaritan woman. And suddenly there is
Mm,
this great reversal. The people in places where we assume most of all you are
mm,
most likely to encounter God in the gospel stories, Jesus says, actually, you might want to rethink that. And
mm,
the places
mm,
where you think you're least like, this person has nothing to teach me, and there is no
mm,
way I'm going to encounter God in this place, actually becomes the most enriching encounter with God. And I think we
mm,
need to, and certainly for me in ministry, um, it became very important for me not just to teach that as such, but I had to model it.
mm,
I had to resist the kind of urge to be in the building all the time and constantly about ministry things and Christian things. But
mhm, mhm.
actually, and it became a standing job. He's in his coffee shop again, or he's doing this again, or he's doing that again. And
Yeah.
I just have to put up with that. So that
Mm,
because I try and model that, what for me has become actually quite an important part of how ministry works and how local church ought to
mm,
work as well.
mm. And I
Mm.
wonder sometimes if part of the challenge of modeling that um, does mean that some of that sort of kindness, that sort of self-care that you were talking about earlier, because I think there can be a big pressure, um, well, on all of us really, but perhaps for those of us in ministry, to be busy or at least to appear busy.
Yeah.
To be effective, to constantly be launching something or casting vision or, always know what's next kind of thing. And to model a lifestyle of actually, I need to nurture my own relationship with God. And that's not about being more effective or having a sharper vision or whatever. It's just about that this is how I believe life is best lived. And if I'm not doing that, if I'm not modeling that, I'm as bad as the Pharisees who are putting burdens on other people that they themselves aren't carrying. So that's really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think part of our role in ministry, and it's not easy, and some of us find it very hard, but to be a person of peace, and to be a symbol of peace, and to
Mm,
be the
mm,
presence of peace in our communities, to be
mm,
that, even in the anxious times, though the mountains fall into the sea, God still reigns in his heavens, and we
mm,
hold on to that, hard as that might be. And I think sometimes as you're probably, I don't know how old you are, but the kind of the dad's army back in the 70s, don't panic, Mr. Manning, don't panic. And this
yeah,
kind of,
yeah,
we're shouting it in our panic.
yeah.
And
Mm,
actually we're so often, and I think in many ways it has become as important as it's ever become. We could talk about the impact of COVID and post-COVID on the church, and I think anxiety levels have increased. People are anxious for the future of churches, and people have left. Some churches are recovering better than others. There's been a stress test on the church. People have struggled to maintain their relationship with God. Relationships have fractured. Anxiety and tensions have built. And the instinctive reaction, I think, from leaders is to try and fix it and to make it all better again and to do something. And that kind of politics is, that's something, let's just do it. We just need to do something and justify existence by doing something, whether it's actually useful or not. And I think we need to resist that. There may be times when we do need to do something, of course there is, but stop, hold back for a little while and just wait. Sometimes it is about the fact that actually by not doing something can sometimes say far more about our confidence in God and not feel the need to do something, and God's not doing something, so we better do something because he's clearly not, or we've got to give him a poke or something. But actually there's a wonderful book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church by Alan Kreider, and his argument is that the greatest virtue nurtured by the early church in the midst of persecution was just the sheer capacity to be patiently expectful of God's faithfulness to them. They were a non-anxious presence in a volatile world, and that's what attracted so many people to the life of the church. That in a world that was kind of crashing down, anxious for this, that, and the other, they were this extraordinarily patient, at peace with themselves and at peace with God community, supporting and nourishing one another. And I think, again, at this time, that's something, again, we perhaps can try and cultivate a little more of in some places.
And in terms of some of the things that you've mentioned, I guess the discipline of silence is going to feed that, isn't it? To learn that actually, I was very moved listening to Ruth Rice recently when she spoke at the Central Ministers Fellowship, talking about, was it 9 months, a year, when she was just laid up in bed and discovering that when she was doing nothing, she was still loved by God, still valued by God. And to deliberately do nothing, to discover that alone is going to empower, everything that you've just said about, it's not about how clever our strategy is or how brilliant the sermon is that explains all this, or some of those fixes that you rightly say that leaders are so tempted by. It is to operate out of that place of confidence, and surety. Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, one of my favorite, I've said this a number of times over the years, I love those bits in the Old Testament where it says King so-and-so reigned for, I don't know, 25 years or something, and then went to be with his ancestors, and so then became king, whatever it is. And that's all you've got. We don't need to say anything more. It doesn't mean that the community wasn't faithfully worshipped. It doesn't mean the priests weren't sacrificing. It doesn't mean the rhythms and patterns of prayers were continuing. But actually, that's fine. And that gets a line in scripture. And we live in an age where everybody's got to make a mark and everybody's got to leave their mark. We're anxious. Am I making my mark? What will my legacy be? And sometimes that can be helpful. But actually, there's parts of scripture that just kind of liberate. You came, you were faithful, you were obedient to God, you came for a time, you cared for God's people, and you moved on. You know what? Sometimes that'll get you in scripture as much as anything else will. And this use that word again, this tyranny of like you said earlier, that busyness. I've got to do something. I've got to be seen to be doing something. My background's in education. Everybody I speak to who's in education is fed up with another Secretary of State for Education who's changing everything simply to justify their own existence. And again, I think we would do well to just hold back from that, or be a little more discerning sometimes about our instinctive activism.
Yeah, amazing. One last question. You were talking there about I think you mentioned two books that have really helped you. So you're obviously a avid reader. What else are you reading at the moment?
What else am I reading at the moment? I've usually got it's probably my curiosity and my magpie-ness. I start lots of books and I rarely finish them. So I'm reading a book on what we've got here. So I've got Beyond Homelessness, Christian Faith in a Culture of Displacement. So this is along the lines of some of the things I've been talking about. What does it mean to be at home? And some people have a house they live in, but they're not at home. And some people don't have a house, but they have a home. And what does it mean for us as Christians to sort of have a home, a place to dwell and to be in God's presence? So I'm reading that at the moment. What else am I reading? Somebody encouraged me to get hold of Wendell Berry's collected poems, so I've been trying to dip in to that. I'm reading crime fiction, Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe. So I've made a start on that. I'm trying to think which series of crime fiction. I tend to read a whole series, so all of the my mind's gone completely blank. The Scottish detective who begins with R, I think. Anyway, somebody listening to this.
Someone will put it in the chat.
Read all of those and then had to give them, and then read another set of crime fiction. So I'm reading that as well. What else am I trying to think what I've got downstairs? I'm reading Jeremy Bowen's book on the 6-Day War.
Wow.
So I'm reading that. Sort of, again, it sort of started, but sort of waiting for me to pick it up again. I'm sure there's one or two other things. I've got a little little pile of books here just sort of waiting for me to dip into. And so,
Well, that's impressive, because I must be honest. Once I start a book, I can't have a few on the go. I'm much more. I don't finish them all, but I'm much more sticking with them as far as I will go.
Yeah, your pattern's probably better than mine. But
Right. Don't know about that. Oh, well, thanks ever so much, Rob. It's been so good to chat and really helpful.
It's been great. Thank you.
To bounce it around.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, amazing. And next time we're hoping to see a Welsh jersey in the background. Scarf's good, but
it's a good start, but it's not the finish. More to be done. Yeah.
I'm sure we could get you a Wales bucket hat as well. And thanks ever so much.
All right, John. Bless you. Thank you.